It's a little early for Halloween, Simmons.
Where you're going, every day's Halloween.
You know, I've watched a lot of terrible superhero movies for the sake of your guys' entertainment, and yet, somehow, Spawn is genuinely the worst superhero movie I've watched thus far. Spawn isn't even a fun, bad superhero movie like Catwoman. Catwoman is the perfect example of something being so bad that it's good, which is exactly why I love Catwoman. Spawn, on the other hand, is just terrible all around. Before I spend the rest of the video rightfully and frustratingly trashing Spawn for all of the right reasons, there are 3 positive things I can say about Spawn. The first thing being, Spawn's armor honestly doesn't look that bad for a movie that was released in 1997. I'll give credit where credit's due. You can tell they at least cared about Spawn's armor. The second thing, there's a scene where Spawn drops from the ceiling, and even though the cave's visual effects look absolutely terrible during the scene, it's a pretty dope shot. I can't even lie about that if I wanted to. There's just something about superheroes dropping from the ceiling to start a full-on action scene that is so cool to me. That is something that I genuinely think will never get old to me. And finally, the third positive thing that I can say, the final shot of Spawn sitting on top of a rooftop as it thunderstorms and his cape is just floating there looks dope. That's all I got when it comes to saying positive things about this movie. As for the negative side of things, where do I even begin? You know what? I'm gonna say something, and I mean this in the most jokingly way possible. Before I rant about Spawn, I want to specifically establish that I'm not trying to be overly harsh on this movie, or even be more critical of Spawn than I typically am with superhero movies. It's just hard to not be annoyed with Spawn when the entire movie ultimately has way too many flaws that are hard to ignore. Spawn might arguably be the most offensive superhero movie I've ever watched. Spawn is a mess. There's nothing fun about Spawn, there's nothing enjoyable about it, nothing interesting was going on in Spawn's story, and if I'm being entirely truthful, there's nothing competent about Spawn, both story-wise and character-wise. Spawn barely has a motive, and even then the motive is laughable. Even for a 90s movie, there are somehow 3 separate villains that all feel pointless because they don't even have real character arcs. There are portions of the movie that take place in hell that are genuinely the most obnoxious visuals I've ever seen in a superhero movie, to the point where I would describe the visuals as visual vomit. The funniest part about all of this is that I just listed multiple issues that I have with Spawn, yet none of those issues are the #1 problem I have with this movie. The core problem I have with this movie is its editing. Look, I typically never make comments about a movie's editing because what do I know? I'm just a YouTuber who likes nerdy things like superhero movies, comic books, and video games. I'm more than aware that I'm the last person who should ever comment on a movie's editing. However, Spawn is an exception. I can't emphasize this enough. This movie's editing is terrible. For some odd reason, there are multiple times in Spawn where the movie starts a scene, right? The movie then, out of nowhere, will cut away from that scene to start an entirely new, unrelated scene, only for the movie to then cut away again from the newly established scene midway through that scene to then go back to the previous scene to complete the first thought. There were multiple times in this movie where, no lie, I would get confused by this movie's editing and have to rewind the movie back because of how confused I was. For instance, there's a point towards the very end of Spawn where the main antagonist of this movie, Malbolga, just pops up on screen completely unprompted. There's no dialogue for when he pops up on screen, he just roars for reasons, I guess. There is no underlying context that would make Malbolga popping up like a transition scene straight out of Windows Movie Maker make sense. It just happens, and the movie is just like, yeah, I did that, so what? Beyond a ton of scenes cutting off randomly and the random transitions that pop up throughout this movie, what makes Spawn's terrible editing so frustrating is the fact that the story suffers tremendously. From what I can tell from this awful final cut of a movie, there's a story somewhere within Spawn that is seemingly interesting. Just for comparison's sake, let's compare what Spawn seems like it wanted to be versus what Spawn's story actually is. From the sporadic bits and pieces spread around the movie, Spawn seemed like it wanted to originally be a movie that at its core is about love. Al Simmons seems like a mercenary or soldier of some type with a good heart, considering how much he loves his wife. Al just happens to work for a terrible boss, Jason Wynn, who asks him to do terrible things because of his terrible morals, which is the main reason Al is sent to hell. Al doesn't initially agree to lead Malbolga's army, but is sent back to Earth anyway. The side character, Cagliostro, was actually meant to play a much bigger role so he could be the important side character that guides and trains Al to be a hero rather than a villain, which we get a tiny glimpse of towards the last 20 minutes of Spawn. As for the Violator, whose name is Clown or Clowny or whatever, his storyline probably doesn't change much. The Violator probably still is the villain of the movie due to his hatred for Malbolga and jealousy of Spawn. There's just a lot of context missing that would have made his story much better and would have likely included more of the Violator using Angela, Al's wife, as bait to showcase Al's love for Angela rather than Al just screaming about his love for his wife, who's barely in the final cut of Spawn. That's what I think the original story of this Spawn movie was going to be. A mercenary or crusader that dies, gets sent to hell, and is willing to do whatever it takes to protect his wife, whose life is probably in danger and being used as a pawn. Of course, I'm simplifying a lot here, but I truly do think the original story for this movie was likely something along those lines. Unfortunately, that's not what Spawn is at all. This movie is just about as close to surface level as one can get. The movie tells you everything you need to know, but doesn't do a damn thing to grow upon these ideas or concepts. Prepare yourself, because this is Spawn's story. Al Simmons is a soldier of some kind. He loves his wife. He also works for a bad guy who wants world domination. Why? No one knows. Al's boss sends him on a mission and betrays him out of nowhere with zero context in the first 20 minutes of the movie, despite it feeling like it was supposed to originally happen during the midpoint of Spawn. Al dies and goes to hell. He gets powers from a demon named Malbolga, who is never explained at all and wants Al to kill his boss for unknown reasons. A 5-year time skip happens and Al is sent back to Earth looking weird as hell, pun intended. He looks for his wife because that's his core personality trait. She's married to his best friend now, and this makes Al miserable. Al then wakes up and realizes he has to kill his boss. He tries to kill his boss, fails, becomes miserable again, and then is given wisdom from a dude named Cagliostro. Suddenly, he officially becomes Spawn and has a random realization that the Violator has been working against him this whole time with, yet again, zero context. They go to hell, fight, Spawn wins, and then he's sitting on a rooftop while it's thunderstorming. Movie ends, that's it. That is Spawn's story. Now you might be wondering, am I purposely leaving anything out to make Spawn sound worse than it is? Well, you see, no I am not. Spawn is that bad, guys. Although there is a genuinely pointless subplot involving a kid named Zach that goes absolutely nowhere and feels entirely shoehorned into this movie. If there are Zach from Spawn fans out there, you're welcome. I didn't forget Zach. As a movie, Spawn just feels so incredibly disjointed. The movie is trying to do so much that ultimately the entire movie doesn't feel cohesive at all. It tries to do so many different things and it wants to explore so many different ideas, themes, or more, but none of them are explored to their completion. Like, Spawn has one goal in this movie, and that's to kill his boss, Jason Wynn. That one core plot point is repeated so many times, only for Wynn to not die and for Al to never confront Wynn at the end of the film. Wynn just gets arrested at the end of the movie, even though the entire movie's plot happens because Wynn kills Al, who is sent to hell and is forced to make a deal with a demon that gives him powers in exchange for one thing: killing Jason Wynn. Instead, Al needing to kill Wynn gets thrown out of the window because Clown becomes the Violator and takes over the final act of the movie. And although this plot point felt like it wanted to originally be a plot twist, Al realizes this plot twist with zero context. As I said, a scene just happens and it dawns on Spawn that the Violator is working against him. There's no context to the scene, there's no setup for that realization, and there's no way Spawn could have had that knowledge. It just happens because, just like the rest of this movie, there's a massive lack of context. Case in point, there's a side character whose name is Cagliostro. As I mentioned, he does absolutely nothing in this movie besides one thing. Cagliostro only exists because this movie needed a stereotypical protagonist of a superhero movie who learns how to use their powers thanks to the help of a side character scene. And that's what Cagliostro is there for. He just pops up and is like, "Hey Al, dude, you got powers, but you need to use them for good. So do yourself a favor, go be Spawn and go save the world," or whatever. The problem though is that it happens like 1 hour into the movie, which is literally right before the final fight and right before the movie ends. Why? Why is this the case? It makes no sense. That type of character development is needed far earlier into a superhero movie. It's like there are so many good ideas within Spawn, but it ultimately fails to be any good because everything is missing context, missing setup, or simply feels out of place chronologically. This, unfortunately, is due to the director of Spawn, who apparently butchered the final cut of Spawn for the sake of having a ton of visual effects, which, as I said, were god awful. Finally, this brings me to the Violator. I despise the Violator. I legitimately don't think I've ever hated a side character in a movie this much before. Do you want to know what my problem is with this character? Violator is written as a comedic relief character. He's written like every single time he's on screen, he's supposed to make you laugh. Here's the problem though, this character is awful. He's not funny, he's not entertaining, he's not written cleverly, and he's just straight up obnoxious. Every single time this character appears for a scene, I want him to leave. I want him to go and do something else off screen. It makes it even worse that he has a half-assed subplot, which is that he's faking his friendship with Spawn because he wants to kill Spawn, since he apparently took the role he's always wanted, which is being the leader of Balboga's army. You know, now that I think about it after saying his purpose in this movie out loud, his subplot makes absolutely no sense. What was the purpose of waiting for Al to turn into Spawn before attacking him and trying to kill him? Logically, that makes no sense. Al didn't want his powers at first, and Al didn't know how to use his powers for the entirety of this movie. The Violator could have easily killed him at the beginning of the movie. It wouldn't have been hard or required a lot of effort whatsoever. And honestly, that would have created a much better movie plot. Imagine the Violator kills Spawn in the beginning of the movie, which sends Spawn back to hell for a second time, which then leads to Balboga giving Spawn even stronger powers so he can get revenge and kill the Violator instead. Now that's a much better movie plot if you ask me. Like, why didn't the Violator try to take advantage of Al in the very beginning of the movie to get what he wanted? Am I missing something? Does this make too much sense? At this point, does anybody care? You know what? I want to take a moment to list some movies off. Batman and Robin, Catwoman, Fantastic Four, Rise of the Silver Surfer, Fantastic Four 2015, Green Lantern, Suicide Squad, and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3. I have watched and reviewed every single one of these movies on this channel, and Spawn is worse than all of them. It's not as lighthearted as Batman and Robin, it's not as fun as Catwoman, it's not as coherent as Green Lantern, it doesn't have as good of a soundtrack as Suicide Squad. That's a positive for that movie, right? According to my script here, this is where I'm supposed to say something positive about the Fantastic Four movies and TMNT 3, but I don't have anything good to say about any of those movies. This is awkward. Regardless, Spawn is still worse than all of those movies. It has ridiculously obnoxious visuals, it has abysmal CGI, it has a plot that feels absolutely incoherent, and it's a terribly edited movie. This movie has not aged well at all. And I know that somewhere out there are people who are fans of this movie. There are people who probably think this movie is overhated and underrated. To those likely small numbers of people out there, you are wrong. Spawn 1997 is arguably the worst superhero movie ever made, and I promise you, it is even worse than you remember.